We'll be starting up here in about, a little over a minute. Uh, so as you're signing in, go ahead and open up your pods, your chat pod, your Q&A pod, and your um, Poll Everywhere, which is a website, or you can download the app. And we'll give folks another 30, 40 seconds to log in. Okay, good morning and welcome. Uh, my name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Cornell Local Roads Program. We're your New York State LTAP Center, and welcome to one of our foundational webinars. Today we're talking about grants, state aid, federal aid. Essentially, where do you get the money? You got to pay for everything. Okay? And good morning to you, Adam. Um, This is one of a series of foundational webinars. We started this a few years right after coming out of COVID. Started a few years ago, and we're now in the fourth cycle of this series. The next series, we're going to be doing one more before the end of the year on pavement management. That's actually worth a professional development hour. Departmental duties will come up on the first week of January, then legal issues on the 14th. We're taking a week off for the county superintendents, and then we'll talk about drainage laws. We got a couple legal things, but those hopefully will be useful to folks. We'll be doing these through February and a little into March before we start our spring workshop series. That is now out and available. You can sign up for the spring workshops. We actually are going to be doing some work zone workshops as well as part of a grant from the Governor's Traffic Safety Committee. Watch this space and watch our website, and we're having more details on that launched here pretty quick because we're setting up the sites for that right now. Now, as I mentioned to some of you who got in right at the beginning, on your screen, you may want to go ahead and open up your pods. The chat pod is available for you to get information from us and links so you don't have to write everything down. Okay, so that's a pretty important thing to know about. The other thing is the Q&A. That's where you can input questions. Any question you've got, we'll try to get it answered. And if you can't access the polls, you can access and send the answer in via the Q&A. And I may ask you to raise your hand a couple of times now and then. So keep that in mind. Now, what we're going to talk about today, we're going to be talking about budgets, responsibilities. In other words, what have you got to pay for? And what are the ownerships and costs of the highways that we've got? How do we finance the highway departments and the DPWs and some sources of revenue? And of course, what do we do next? How do we take all this information and use it as we move forward? Now, to help me out, let's see who's on the call today. We're going to do a little bit of introduction polls with our Poll Everywhere. So let's get started with that. And first, who do you work for? And some of you have jumped the gun, but that's cool because that poll is already active. I started it earlier. So we've got city and village folks. We've got county. We got some towns. We got we got a bunch of people working for the weekend. Okay, we got some honest folks, some consultants, and some state or federal. Well, that's a pretty darn good mix. I like it. Okay. What is your job? Are you an administrator? You work for the highway department, commissioner, engineer, planner, field crew, supervisor, board member, none of the above? If you put none of the above, please do me a favor and throw in the Q&A pod what that means. Say, what is your role? Just helps me as I'm sort of laying this out. Nobody put in. We got one person who put in for the none of the above, but okay. A lot of engineers today. Okay. And then finally, where in the state are you from? So we'll click on a map. I'm just trying to get a sense. Is this more urban or rural today? Are we all over the states? We have our friend who lives on Lake Ontario. I like it. That's a really good variety. It's all over the state. That's good. Like to see that. And again, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your frenemies. Please have them join us. The more the merrier. This whole idea here. So let's look at New York State highway ownership and just get a sense of what the scale is. Sometimes it's hard to imagine how many roads there are. In terms of the about 115,000 miles of roads in the state that are owned by municipalities, about half of them are owned and or maintained by town highway departments or DPWs if they've gone to a DPW format. Counties own the next biggest batch, just under 20% at 18. The state is about 13%. Villages are at about 6%, and cities are about 11. But this is only based on center line mileage, not traffic volume. If you look at it by volume, as we do in some of the other workshops, the state system, even though it's only 13%, has more than half the volume. But we have to maintain these things. So we have done over the past, we've done some cost calculations. You may have seen these. We haven't done anything since COVID, partly because of inflation issues, but partly because we wanted to try to get away from the COVID bubble. So these costs that I'm going to give you are per mile pre-COVID. We have done some estimates on how much they've gone up since COVID, and we'll talk about those. But essentially, if you're with a town, this is what you're spending. This is not what you need. This is what you're spending on average across the state. So if we look at it, towns were about 14,000 with a range that's pretty wide. Counties are about 35,000, villages also about 35, just under, and cities just around 35 as well, just above. That actually makes some sense when you start thinking about it. COVID, you should take these numbers and add anywhere from 20 to 30%, depending on where you are in the state and other factors. And again, we'll probably look at those data and update them now that we've got enough years after COVID to get us some good statistics that we can actually trust. But so that would mean that towns are in the range of about 18,000, counties are just over 40, villages are just under, and cities, 42, 43, somewhere in that range. Now, people go, well, that's expensive. If you look at the cost, let's look at the towns, per mile, and you can see in parts of the state, well, the cost per mile for towns is pretty high. You get down along New York City, you get in some urban areas, but if you think about it, that makes sense because not only do those towns have to deal with the roads they've already got, but they've got a lot more traffic. They've got a lot more volume, okay? And more people, too. So that's okay. Now, if we look at what a highway department spends relative to the rest of the municipality, and again, we're going to focus on towns because it not only makes a nice, pretty map, but it's also a lot of data that we can look at. We've done similar things for villages, cities, and counties as well. But if you look at the cost of the highway department as a percentage of the budget, you can see that in a few cases, the town highway department is actually pretty small because towns are doing a lot of other things, especially in urban areas. But if you look at it in more rural areas, the town highway department is a pretty high percentage. It's usually the largest department in terms of budget. And if you added in infrastructure, water, sewer, parks, things like that, most towns are above 50%. A lot of counties are just under because of social service issues, and cities and villages vary quite a bit around the state. But we got to pay for everything. So let's just ask, and there's our first open-ended poll. Department responsibilities. Put in one word what your department, or what you think a typical department, has to maintain. What's a highway department maintain? We got to do snow plowing. A lot's been done that the last week. Quite a few of you. Some of you are still doing it. Yeah. You got to take care of bridges. Yep. Maybe you got to put some sand in. You got culverts. You got signs. It's good. I like it. Okay. You got the pavement. And we're thinking about next year's pavement projects. Maintenance and capital construction and keeping things safe and dealing with integrity, basins. You might be in an MS4, a municipal separate storm water sewer system. You might have trees to deal with. You might have guide rail of some type, or rail if you just want the more generic term, so you don't have to worry about what state we're in. You may have to maintain the right-of-way. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that you can think about. And we could go through and we could spend a lot of time talking about those departmental responsibilities, okay? So the big four, the ones that cost us the most money, are our roads and our bridges, but also our snow plowing, which drives a lot in terms of the size of the department, and of course, all the communication we have with the public, mostly via signs. So there are lots of lists of department responsibilities. But here's the thing. Most departments, even in rural towns, do a lot more than just maintain highways. And if you're in a city or a village or a county, you're certainly going to be doing additional duties, okay? So, here's an example of some additional duties that might be in your bag of tricks. Some people actually have electricity. Some do garbage collection, leaf pickup, water, sewer, parks, recycling, cemeteries, even maintaining the buildings and the grounds. So let me bring back up that poll. I'm going to clear the information on the poll. And what I want you to put in this time are things that your department does that are not highway related. That are not highway related. So put the non-highway related things up now that your department maintains. Lights. Ooh, holiday events and lights. Yes, sidewalks, parks, trails. Maybe some response for tree trimming and things like that. Safety issues. Yeah. Yeah, all kinds of different things that are maintained. Trees is a big one. And of course, there's an overlap. We know that there's a balance with trees that part of a highway department's responsibility and from a safety standpoint. There's solid waste, there's recycling. But you think about all of the things you've got to maintain beyond just the stuff that we think about as traditional for a highway department. Okay? So keep those things in mind as we move forward, as we figure out how do we pay for all of this stuff. Now, in terms of the cost of all of these things, if you look at data from the state comptroller, and by the way, if you want a list of any of the resources we used to develop this webinar and some links you might want to look at later on for finding funds, you can download the handout. To download the handout, make sure your chat pod is opened, and in about a minute or two, Amanda will repost a link to the handout so you can download it. If you can't download it, just send her an email and she'll pop it in an email to you, because we know some folks have a hard time accessing the box where we store these things. But if you look at town highway departments, these are data from 2022, okay? Surprisingly, the numbers totals haven't really changed since pre-COVID. We didn't spend like we might have thought we did. We went up some, but towns are spending about 83% of their funding coming from local funds. We'll talk about where those funds come from in just a minute. State funding, again, we'll talk about that as well. CHIPS is what most people think of, but there's additional state funding. That's going to be about 14%. And then federal funds is actually a very small percentage of funding for towns to deal with transportation-related issues, which includes highways and other transportation-related activities, okay? Now, there's a bit of a, I call it the butterfly effect. If you change one little thing, you can change a lot of other activities. And sometimes thinking about things can help you a lot in terms of how you move forward. So let's just think about this for a second. What would happen if you had an extra $10,000? We asked that question, just $10,000, which is a pretty small amount. Heck, that's probably less than a lot of you actually have for when you have to go out and get quotes. Okay, if you had just $10,000, what would you spend the money on? We actually asked that question of everybody in the state. And here's the answer we got. Most of you would put that into doing maintenance on your roadways or buying some updated equipment, just upgrading what you've already got. Not brand new stuff. We know for $10,000 you can't do that, but you know, a little bit more chip sealing, maybe some crack repairs, fixing that old trailer that isn't working well, upgrading the electricity in a building, taking care of some drainage, buying some toolkits down, maybe some signs, even giving a bonus for something out with a small amount of money can make a big difference. Now, if that money was a little bit larger, like say 250,000, we asked that question as well. Well, again, roads and equipment were still by far the biggest place we would spend our money. In this case, though, instead of doing just maintenance, we might do some overlays or reconstructions. We might do a brand new truck or something like that, though obviously for 250, you can't get the snowplow with it because the costs have gone up by that much. But again, different things people had for priorities. Interestingly, when we asked, nobody with 250 would spend the money on signs, increasing salary, or tools. When they saw the 250, they thought, oh, with 250, I might as well spend it on the big things. But, you know, little things can make a difference. Maybe we should blend those. And there were some folks who did some mixed answers that talked about really trying to use those funds sort of holistically to look at the entire system. Now, why are we doing all this? What's this all for? Well, who uses our roads and streets is an important question. So who is the user of roads and streets? Who do we actually serve? Who are we working for? We're working for everybody, the public, the community, public, yeah, civilians. Okay, our constituents. If you're elected, that's very important. Your constituents. Okay, your businesses, your residents, very good. I like that. You got to have roads that can serve us for emergency response. You know, they like to talk about emergency response, but if you can't get there, It doesn't matter whether you have a fire truck on the way. You got to have those roads. You got to service farms, businesses, schools. Yeah, very good. You're serving everybody, but who the public is does vary a little bit. And so, what's the level of service? What are the things you have to do? So, let's go take that same data we talked about for the cost for the roads, and let's flip it on its head. Everybody says it's expensive, but let's look at the actual cost per person for towns. In New York State, the average cost for town highways is still under $1 a day. Now, yes, there are parts of the state, especially rural areas, where the cost per person goes way up because there's so few people and there's still a minimum cost to maintain everything. But on the average, you're paying less for your road, which you have to get to work, or school, or church, or the shopping mall, than a cup of coffee. Okay? In fact, this is probably a 2 or 3 days worth. In some cases, it's the whole week for one cup of coffee to maintain those roads. And even if you add back in the cost of the county roads and the city and village streets within your area where you live, your total cost per day is probably less than $2, okay, per day. And yes, there's some rural areas it's more, but it's really a pretty good bargain. But how do we pay for all of this? What are the sources of funding? So let's think about where we get our money. We're going to get our money from local sources. We might have some state sources we can get funds from, and then there'll be some federal sources. So let's talk about these sources, and don't want to forget about the fact there may be some private funds available. Okay, you might be able to get some monies in a private with partnerships or as someone's doing development, and you may be able to borrow funds, which you're still paying for the cost of the borrowing, and usually that's done with local, but you can stretch the dollars out to keep things going, okay? Now, as we talk about funding, remember there's different types of funds, okay? And by the way, if you're wondering, this is an old picture I found in some old glass slides. These are wooden water pipes, okay? Yeah, water pipes used to be made out of wood. But how do we maintain these things? Well, you could get an allocation of funds. These are funds that are just given to the municipality. They're allocated to them. And there's no competition. Everybody gets a bit of an allocation. These are shared funds, CHIPS funds, things like that. There may be a formula behind them, but you're going to get those on an annualized basis. There may be grants. Okay, those grants usually are competitive grants. You're competing with other folks. They may be allocation grants where everybody can get it, but they have to apply for the funds. And only if you apply do you actually get the grant. Okay, slightly different than a pure allocation. Remember, most grants, not all, but most grants have a match. That match may be 50-50, it may be 20-80, it may be as little as 5% that the local municipality has to cover with local funds, but it's something to be aware of. Again, if you're borrowing funds, there may be a loan that you can take out, and then you have to pay for the cost of the loan, but that can stretch your dollars when it's hard to cover the cost of some really large project, like a new highway garage, a new jail, a brand new bridge if you're a small town, things like that. And of course, just have to mention, there's always a combination of things that we can deal with. So let's go through those 4 primary places that we get funds. Let's talk about them a little bit. And the first, because it's the largest, is local revenue. Where do you get your local revenue right now? Where do you get your local revenue? Taxes. Yeah. These are the answers coming in. What kind of taxes? What kind of taxes? Be a little more specific. You could do a bond sale. Yeah, you could sell bonds. Yeah, we do that quite often. Okay. Everybody's putting taxes in. Let's see if anybody gets more specific with their taxes or if it's just catching up on the taxes. Yeah, everybody's thinking about taxes. But what kind of taxes are we dealing with? Permits, yeah, you might get a small amount of money for charging for permits. Yeah, that's a possibility as well. Yeah. Okay. And fees, taxes and fees and permits, a little bit of money. Sales tax, yeah. The biggest 2 are property and sales taxes. Somebody's beat me to the punch. Yeah. So again, there's taxes, but there's different kinds of taxes. And there's different requirements for how you can gain those taxes. So these are all things you have to think about and you have to know a little bit. Okay, so let's go through a list. I went and made a list of the kind of sources that people have for local funding. You could even have a mortgage tax. Okay, some have that. You can have property taxes, which is by far the largest tax at the local level. You could have sales tax. Some cases that's shared from the state. Some cases direct sales tax. Depends on the municipality and the type. You could have tourism taxes that exist. Sometimes they're called bed taxes. Hey, let's put a tax on the people who are coming in from out of town. You can get revenue from another municipality. If you're doing snow plowing for somebody else, there's a revenue. Now, I will tell you, the revenue from another municipality is usually offset by the cost of doing the work, but you do need to include it in your budget. So it is something just to imagine just keeping it contractual revenue. Keep that in mind, okay? You can have what's known as a payment in lieu of taxes, sometimes called a pilot, okay? This is usually with nonprofits who pay in lieu of taxes. Obviously, Cornell University does that. SUNY schools, community colleges do these things. They pay a payment in lieu of taxes to cover services. I will tell you right now, every school that pays these taxes, every nonprofit who pays these taxes will tell you they pay too much, and everybody at the municipality says they pay too little. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to tell you there's something called a pilot that you might want to think about. And you need to set that in a way that's reasonable for both sides. Obviously, y'all mentioned fees. The most common fees that we have out there are fees for things such as garbage, utilities, services like that. Okay. You might have licensing fees that you could deal with. And this is one that should not be thought about as a separate source of funds, but it is very important to get it right, and that's interfund transfers. If a highway department is working on, say, maintaining the parking lot in front of the town hall, that actually should come out of the general fund from the budget, not from the highway fund. So we really want to be thinking about, if we want apples to apples comparisons, we should make sure highway departments are only using highway funds for highway work, and if they're working on something else, those other activities, those are paid out of the proper funds. Usually a general fund charge, but it could be a special project charge. So if we're trying to think about the total cost for the highway department, we want to make sure those are included as well for local funding, okay? So again, this is going to be anywhere from 80–90% of your cost is going to come from these fund sources. So that's really important to get those things right. And even if you're with a city or a county or a village where the percentages are smaller, it's still an important thing to understand your local funding sources. Now, the next one we always talk about, in fact, this is maybe the biggest driver of our discussion in a lot of ways, is state aid. So where do you get your state aid? What fund sources do you have to get money from the state? Let's see what you come up with. CHIPS, the most common. We all talk about CHIPS. In fact, we tend to lump all of the allocated funds that we get from the state under the word CHIPS. And I see somebody put that in the Q&A, and that's good. There's some grants out there. Let's, think about what grants you get. There's this new program called the State Touring Route Program, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. Yeah, that's available possibly. You might be able to get yourself on the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP. Now, that might be state funds. It might be federal funds. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we'll talk about the difference between the two in a little bit. There's both difference in requirements and there's difference in terms of some regulations you got to deal with. There's the POP money. We'll talk about POP or Pave New York programs here in just a minute. Yeah, very good. There's lots of sources of state aid, and we mostly think about the state aid for highway departments, but let's not forget other ones, and we'll talk about them. Someone put Bridge New York. Bridge New York, surprisingly, is not a state program, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. And yes, EWR, Emergency Winter Recovery. So let's just start looking at this list that everybody sort of gave us here. And that list of funds from the New York State Local Programs Bureau is really now 5 separate programs. These are really mostly allocation type funds. Okay, so you get CHIPS based on a formula, based on the number of registrations, the vehicle traffic, the population. There's a formula involved for getting CHIPS with some hold harmless clauses. involved. So CHIPS is by far the biggest. Okay, so you can get your New York CHIPS. There's a program called Pave New York, which has additional funds. There's a program that's now pushing 15, maybe even 20 years old called Emergency Winter Recovery. Okay, there's the state touring route funds. If you aren't aware of this, there were additional funds put in the budget. Now, this is our third year of having this program available. If you have a state touring route, especially villages, but some county roads and even some town roads, there's a state number, but it's actually maintained by the municipality. There's additional funds for that. Ithaca, for instance, gets almost $4 million a year for all the state highways in the city of Ithaca that are under this new program. Now, can you spend it all? That's the question we're going to talk about here when we get to talk about what's next. But there's additional funds that are available. And finally, there's Pave Our Potholes. That program is for not filling potholes, it's for paving. Okay, so it's more capital money, but it's got a nice acronym, Pave Our Potholes, or POP. So just be aware these funds are available. Okay? Now, these are funds. Just before I leave this slide, how many of you have used or are aware of the state touring route program? Raise your hand. Go down to the bottom of your screen and raise your hand if you have used or at least are aware of that program. Okay, so about a quarter of you. I would tell you right now, even if you're not in a state touring route, you may want to look into that program. There may be some availability of those funds if they're not being utilized by somebody else. There are runs available for how much money your municipality is eligible. Go check. It doesn't hurt. It only takes a couple of minutes, and the links are in the handout. You don't have to memorize this. It's all through the Local Programs Bureau. You can get the runs for your municipality for the total amount of funds available in each of these different programs. Okay? No point in not using the funds that are available to you. So now what I want to do, I'm going to go back, I'm going to bring back up our sources of state aid. I'm going to clear the screen again. And this time I want you to put in state aid that is not those things that come through the local programs, the thing I just listed on the previous screen. In other words, I'm even going to go back to that slide. I don't want you to put these answers down. What other things? You've mentioned one. Okay, Culvert, New York. You've mentioned one. I'll give you one as a giveaway. But where else have you gotten money from the state, not just the State Local Programs Bureau? What other sources have you gotten? CFA. I don't have to know that particular acronym. If you put an acronym in there, spell it out for me just so we make sure we get our acronyms right. I know TAP. TAP is the Transportation Assistance Program, or Transportation Alternatives Program, excuse me. HSIP stands for the Highway Safety Improvement Program. FEMA, that's actually a federal program, though there are some state programs through the State Department of Homeland Security. There's the New York State DEC, Water Quality Improvement Program. WQIP, or sometimes just called WaterQuip, I've heard. Yep, there's Consolidated Funding App. Oh, yes, this is for the municipalities. There's Regional Economic Development Councils. There's the State Department of State that has had funding. There's Parks and Trails New York. Yeah, there's actually quite a few other sources of funds out there. So you may want to go look for some of those funds, okay? You'd be surprised. There's Industrial Access. The DOT has some programs available. I think some of those funds are actually being used as part of the Micron stuff. There's Green Innovation Grants. There's more out there than you might think, okay? And any programs that you can think of, share them with your friends after, of course, you apply. Safe Routes to School, that's an old program. It actually has been merged into other things, and most of those actually have federal dollars tied to them, but we'll come back to those in a little bit. So let me highlight a couple of ones that you might not be aware of or understand some slight differences. We'll start with the one that I think creates the most confusion for folks, and that's Culvert, New York. Culvert, New York is part of the Bridge New York program. Those bridge and culvert funds, the difference has to do with where the pot of money comes from. If the span is essentially over 20 feet, we're going to call that a bridge. That's going to fall in the Bridge New York program. That is a federal program. Those are federal dollars. If this thing is under 20 feet, it's going to be called a culvert by the state, and therefore it's going to come out of the Culvert New York funds. Now, whether it's designed like a bridge, whether it should be treated like a bridge, that's an engineering problem. But in terms of funding, 20 feet and over, we're going to use bridge funds. That's federal for Bridge New York. and if it's under, it's going to be culvert in New York. It's all part of the same process, but the requirements, the things you have to do to meet the requirements change. It's a little less paperwork, though there is still some things you have to follow if you're getting money for the culvert New York program. So it's a span thing. There's about $100 million for culverts and about 150 for bridges. And again, those numbers will be allocated at the state. That's one of those ones that's not a straight allocation. It's a grant program. You apply for the funds. It's competitive. Okay, but I will say that now people are applying for it, but there was a time we actually turned some culvert New York money back in. Ooh, don't want to do that. Okay. The other one you might want to think about, and we actually utilize this one quite often, is things like the Governor's Traffic Safety Committee. GTSC is sometimes called. We actually get some funds through the Highway Safety Grants program. That's how we pay for those work zone packages that I mentioned. We're doing some workshops. We're using those funds to help pay for not only the highway equipment that we're going to give out to 30 municipalities, but for 8 or 9 workshops being held around the state on work zone traffic control. And therefore, the cost to you is zero. It's not free because it's being covered by a grant. You know, we don't say something is free. We just say that the cost is zero to you. You've already paid for it with your taxes. Okay. But there are some other programs that we've come across. So for instance, you may have heard of the live edge plows that were being used in Canandaigua, Gorham, and the city of Canandaigua. And that was through the State Department of State. And they had something they called the Sustainable Winter Roads Management Pilot Program. They put out some funds to help see what would happen if we used different approaches to dealing with snow and ice control in urban and rural settings, which is why both the town and city of Canandaigua and the town of Gorham was involved. So they were able to get live edge plows and liquid tanks for trucks and a few other fancy techniques to try some things out and share that information. That's why we had them at the highway school. Okay? But you might want to think about other places you can get funds. Okay? We've already talked about the Department of State, but someone mentioned in the poll the Department of Environmental Conservation. There are funds available actually for even putting up salt barns. Okay? Through the WQIP program or Water QUIP program that you might want to look into. Okay? The Department of Health has some programs to improve water quality, both surface water and subsurface and municipal water. So you may want to look at that if you have a water system especially. Obviously, the New York State Department of Parks and Recs has some funds as well, so you may want to look into that. There are plenty of other sources out there. You may want to look for them, and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about some of those in a little bit. Okay? Now, let's ask the question about federal aid. Okay? Now, I'm going to lower your hands. I'm going to have you do 2 things at once. That's always challenging. As you're typing these in, raise your hand if you've gotten federal aid. We'll come back and ask that question again. I'm just curious as we get things. You can start typing in the sources of federal aid in there. And we love our acronyms, don't we? FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, Housing and Urban Development, CMAQ, which is the essentially congestion mitigation, air quality stuff. Okay? RAISE, that's a new program, but it's part of the new Infrastructure Act. Yep. CRP, not the best acronym in the world, but there's tons of stuff. Safe Streets for All, sometimes called SS4A. There's, all kinds of different programs that are out there. Sources of federal aid. Okay? Now, we had a whole workshop on this last Thursday on how to go through the federal aid process for roads, but you may want to look at sources of federal aid above and beyond the typical just highway kinds of things. And yes, FEMA is one I would definitely look at, especially after an emergency. And yes, there are some congressional direct funds. They got rid of those for a while. They're back now. Again, I'm not arguing the good or the bad. I'm just saying that they're available. You might as well take advantage of it. So, in terms of the federal projects, this is a list not of even close to all of the possible things. This is a list of the ones that are, I would call these the most commonly accessed federal aid. So there's BILL, which is actually the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. If you're one group, the Infrastructure Investments Job Act, IIJA by others. Part of BILL includes funds including the Safe Streets for All, or SS4A. There's the Surface Transportation Program. There's the Transportation Alternatives Program. These are all outlined in the handout. Congestion mitigation, air quality, i.e. trying to deal with pollutants. Bridge New York, remember I mentioned bridges fall under federal aid, over 20 feet. The highway safety improvement programs, the state is actually about to put out a call for $70 million they're working on for money from Highway Safety Improvement Program. The final number might be different, by the way, so don't hold me to it because they're going through their process right now to get those funds out. And those will be focused on improving local road safety by having local road safety plans and focusing on proven countermeasures. That's when we had a series of webinars back in October, November talking about that. So there's tons of options out there. I mean, if you just look at Bill, for instance, within Bill itself, there are, let me get the number, 25 direct funding opportunities. I list here five that have put out probably the most funds in their first 3 years of Bill. There's 2 more years to go, okay? I suspect there'll definitely be something to replace it. We don't know what. These are the kind of things that help communities all over the country, so they usually may take a while to get in place, but they usually are fairly popular. There's something called RAISE. Again, the acronym boys were out working hard, rebuilding American infrastructure, sustainability, and equity. Infrastructure for rebuilding America, safe streets and roads for all, rural surface transportation. There are actually funds specifically for rural transportation. It's $2 billion for small projects, $200 million or less. Roadway safety projects of $300 million or less, and then there's Appalachian Highway System funds as well. So there's tons and tons of projects out there to deal with, to look at things, and you may want to look at that. A good example of kind of things that are useful, this is one from Buffalo. This is the Kensington Highway, where they're using federal funds to essentially take the Kensington from being essentially a cut through communities, and they're going to cover it back over. Going to knit back together and put the Kensington underground. That total project is probably going to wind up in the range of over $1 billion, and they're getting about 5% of the funds through these reconnecting communities through the state DOT. There's other funds they're using, of course, as well to cover this. In the town of Wappinger in Dutchess County, they used the funds to improve some safety. These were HSIP funds, okay, that were available. They realigned everything, and they improved sight distances. So you might want to look at those kind of funds available. If you've got a rail to trail program, you might want to look at funds that are available for different safety related aspects. They actually used it, in this case, the Transportation Enhancement Program, to update an old railroad station, restore it. And they're using it now as a museum and a rest stop on a rail trail. Okay, so there's some pretty interesting things out there. One that we came across as we were developing this little webinar that I thought was one of my favorites. This is the Village of Green, and I just realized it should be the Village of Green with an E. I forgot. I apologize. Let me get that fixed here. You're right. Here's what's cool. I can fix this right now. My handwriting probably won't be perfect, but let's see what I can do. Here we go. It's the Village of Green. The Village of Green got money through the USDA, okay? The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, has money to upgrade rural utility services. Now, in this particular case, they're going to get a $9 million grant. They're going to take out an $11 million loan. By the time they pay the interest and service the loan, they'll be at about a $4 million to $5 million cost, depending on how inflation and other factors work. So that grant, some of it will be eaten up by the cost of paying for the loan, but at the end of it, they'll get about $4 million. But more importantly, they get the money, all the money they need for $20 million to do the entire water system in a single shot, which would be almost impossible for the village by itself to have the funding available. They'd have a really hard time getting all that funding available. So these, again, it's like borrowing funds, but in this case, it's federal dollars that are able to be used for that, and it's a combination of federal and loans to make things work out. And yeah, you can do big projects. If you ever visit the city of Buffalo, Niagara Street, they got sustainable corridor funds for this. And again, you can tie your own funds. You know, I said earlier there's a match. Well, the match might be on only a portion of it. In this case, the city wanted to do the work anyway. So the total project is about $14 million. The local dollars are actually spending almost 2/3 of those funds, over $9 million. The state and federal is only about 1/3 of the cost. But boy, does it stretch those dollars. It makes it more sustainable. It makes it more likely something's going to get done. So you want to look at these things. They're all tax dollars, but we can stretch the dollars that we have at the local level and do projects that we might not be able to do with just local funds. Obviously, one of the more common things are rail trails, okay? So you can do rail trail projects, especially if there's a transportation alternative program, and of course, safety. Safety is a big key. Absolutely every project that's safety is eligible for federal funds. Just telling you that right now. However, it's almost always a competitive grant process, so you're going to be competitive with everybody else. So we'll talk about how you can be more competitive when we talk about what's next here in just a couple of minutes. So I asked you earlier to raise your hand if you've done a federal project. I'm going to lower your hands now. How many have you completed? How many federal aid programs have you completed? Ooh, we have a 0. We have some zeros. We have a bunch of 10 pluses. We have a 1, 3, 2. Okay, those of you who have done 10 or more, you're experts. We'll have you help us out in the future with new webinars. The rest of you, these are the things you want to think about. Ask yourself some questions about whether you want to get federal aid. I'm not saying you shouldn't. In fact, you should always look at the federal aid, but I want you to know a few things before you make that decision. Because one of the things we found is a lot of times people go get grants, they go get aid, and they realize, oh, we can't really meet the requirements, or we have a cash flow problem, or wow, I didn't realize we had to do this special task. Okay, so these are things to keep in mind. So with local federal aid, with very few exceptions, it is a reimbursement program. That means you actually have to have the cash to pay the contractor, and then you get reimbursed from the state or the feds, depending on which grant you got. Okay, and that process means that you may have to carry up to a couple of months to carry the cash for that. And you either have to have loans or you have to have money in the bank account to pay off the contractors. So keep that in mind. It's a reimbursement program. And to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, you have to have authorization first. Don't just go do the work and then hope to get reimbursed. You have to have permissions to go from some steps to the next step. So I want you to keep that in mind if you're going out and getting federal aid. Unlike CHIPS, where you go, you spend all the money, and you get reimbursed. In this case, it's the same thing, except now you have to get authorized to go from point A to point B. Now, New York State DOT has a pretty cool project development process. It's looks more like the game of life when you actually look at it in detail. And I know what you're all thinking right now. The font is too small, you can't read it. Well, it's just an illustration. If you want, you can go download it off the web. It's also in our federal aid workshop handout. You're welcome to get a copy of that from us. You can really think about like any project. You're going to have planning, you're going to have scoping, you're going to have a design process, you're going to construct it. And remember, at the end of any project that you've got, federal or state aid, you're going to have to maintain it. Can you maintain it? What's the cost of maintaining it? Did you put enough money aside to maintain it? Maybe you change the design to make the operations and maintenance cheaper. It's always a good idea if you can think about it, okay? So let's ask, which of these would be eligible for federal aid? Got some new choices. If you've seen this before, it's new choices. We have a bridge replacement on a local road, a rail to trail project, overlay of a high volume highway, safety improvements at some curves, or improved signal timing along a corridor. Which would be eligible for federal aid? Okay. Now, again, it's one of these quirks of poll everywhere. It just gives me percentages, but you can vote for more than one. But pretty much everybody who voted said, yep, bridge replacement on a local road. Most of you said safety improvements at curves. It turns out any safety-related program is federally eligible. Always eligible. Safety and bridges are always eligible. So that means even improved signal timing might be able to be eligible if you could show a safety improvement, reduction in the number of crashes. In of itself, the timing may not be, but you might be able to. Look at it. Overlay, probably not. Rail to trail actually is very common. There's money specifically for rail to trail conversions for a variety of choices out there. So again, just keep those things in mind. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, if it's a bridge or if it's safety, it's always going to be available for federal funds. The question is, are you competitive? And we'll talk about competition here in just a couple of minutes. Now, are there other grants that you've gotten? Has anybody gotten other grants than the ones we've already mentioned? Anybody else got a grant from somebody else? That may not be. It's okay. Ooh, I don't know that one. NBRC. Boy, that sounds familiar. I don't know these acronyms. There's so many acronyms out there. What does NBRC stand for, I wonder? Anybody want to tell me? Ah, Northern Border Regional. Okay, now that I see it, my brain goes, oh yeah, okay. Monies as you get along the corridor, with Canada along the border. There's monies to do things to improve transportation or communications or safety or security. There's lots of different funds that are out there, okay? There may be some private funds, okay? But again, look for this. EV grants, electric vehicle grants, yep, yep. There's private companies, there's thriving communities. Keep looking, okay? Keep looking. You could take out bonds and borrow funds. That's always a possibility. Um, Again, you're using local dollars or you're mixing it with a grant from somebody else. But the advantage of bonding something is that you're essentially taking the cost and you're spreading it out so that you can afford to do it without a huge change in the taxes. You're spreading things out, much like the same way you buy a house. You can't afford to put the cash down to buy the house, but you can spread the payments out so you can afford to do it. We can do the same thing for big, big projects. You can lease things and then maybe buy them at the end. You can build up capital reserve funds. Okay? Again, the idea is when something's too expensive, we take funds and we spread the cost out over time. Okay? But let me ask you this. Let's start with something simple. Which of these would you pay for with a loan? Dinner out, a wedding, work boots, utility bills, or a brand new bathroom, which I'm about to get to spend money on water pipes. So I know exactly that particular one. Yep. Now, I'm not talking about using your credit card to pay for dinner or to go buy the work boots or even pay the utility bill. But if it's something like that, that's a regular basis, you want to pay that off immediately. You don't want to build interest. You don't want to spend the cost of the money for the loan. And a credit card is still a loan in a lot of ways. You want to pay those things off as quickly as possible. So yeah, new bathroom, everybody agrees. Maybe a wedding. Maybe instead of spending a lot of money on the wedding, you spend more money on helping them with their new bathroom with the new couple. Yeah. What would you pay for? So now let's ask the same question for your highway department. Are you going to bond or finance a dump truck, chip seals, rail to trail conversions, tools for the shop, or a new salt barn? Which one of these would you finance? And again, you can vote for more than one. Yeah, a new salt barn, that's a big expense with a 40, 50-year life. Yeah, that's definitely something you might want to think about financing. A dump truck? It might depend. If you only own 2 or 3 dump trucks for your town and you're only replacing them every 10 to 15 years, maybe you bond that particular activity. But if you're replacing a truck every single year, that's like buying new work boots. Maybe you need to really think about finding a way to get that into the main budget. You're probably not going to do that with chip seals. Okay, you're not going to borrow for those funds. Rail the trail again. What's the life? And I noticed nobody put tools for the shop. Yeah, so these all make sense. Okay, so now what do we do next? We know some sources of funding. We thought about what we're going to finance. There may be some private funds available that we didn't talk a lot about just because of time issues. But what's next? Okay, what do we need to do to move forward with the process? Well, first, and the single most important thing, and I hate to say it, but there's a lot of people who don't necessarily know this, know your local funding. What is in your D accounts if you're with a town or a county? What is in your A account if you're with a city or village that's used for highways or DPW kind of activities? Know and understand where the sources of funding. Are they sales tax dollars? Are they tied to property taxes? So when you see financial changes coming down the road, you can understand limitations. Like if it's mostly property taxes, you're being hit by the property tax cap. Okay? Some of your aid, especially your state aid, is annual. It's an appropriation. Okay? Like CHIPS, EWR, POP, things like that. But some of them you still have to apply. There may be a grant. And by the way, if it's a grant project, it may have to be included in something called the State Transportation Improvement Plan, or STIP. And there's a process for getting things added to the STIP. You first have to get it into a regional transportation improvement plan, which could be through a metropolitan planning organization or through your local DOT region, and then it gets added to the state plan. And then, by the way, if there's federal dollars, it has to be on the STIP at some point. That process can be speeded up, and that's how Bridge New York has been successful, by speeding that process up. And remember, some funds are going to be competitive. Safe Streets for All, almost anything associated with Bill are going to be competitive grants. Okay? And again, those are going to need to be added to the STIP at some point. You're going to go out and you're going to go seek your funding. You're going to go look for your funding, and you're going to be looking at those federal dollars and state dollars and possibly some private dollars. The biggest thing here is make sure you have a realistic timing and budget. Don't go short. Don't go, oh, well, I really need $2 million, but I'm only going to ask for one because I'm more likely to get the funds. No, no, this is not going to your mom and dad and saying, I need $10 to fill the gas tank when you really need 20, and then hope they'll actually give you 5 so you can at least go out that night. No, you need to have a realistic timing and budget, because remember, once you get the grant, it's really hard to go back and get additional funds. Sometimes they're not even available, and the local municipality might be on the hook. So make sure you have a good budget and a good timeline. One of the big problems we see with these supersized projects, these signature projects that people like, they shortchange the cost and it looks like it's more expensive than the original budget. That's really because we shortchanged ourselves. Get realistic timing and budget. Okay? Now, an acronym you need to know. And it's called NOFO, a Notice of Funding Opportunity. Okay, if you hear the term NOFO, that's a Notice of Funding Opportunity. Those are put out literally every single day. Okay, the two biggest places that I would look at, and if you're looking at getting federal or state dollars, go into these websites. They're in the handout, but we'll talk about them, and you can get an email every single day. Okay, at the federal level, it's called grants.gov. Okay, that's the federal one. Just type grants.gov and you can get on the list to get notice of federal aid, and you can even click, I want federal highway ones, I want only ones from certain departments, Department of Transportation, or you can get them all. Okay, there's a lot, so think about that. We do try to post the ones we hear about, but that's the federal level ones. At New York State's level, they call it grantsmanagement.ny.gov. Or if you want to find it, go in the web, your favorite browser, and type New York State Grants. And up will top grantsmanagement.ny.gov and grants.ny.gov. Either one will take you to websites where you can go and get, again, a link of updated grants coming from New York State. Okay? These are for competitive grants, not for the allocations like you get with CHIPS. Those will be sent out directly to the municipality. Before you apply, make sure you understand the funding. Read the NOFO. Don't get yourself in hot water or underwater, like our friend the turtle here is if he's not careful. Okay? If they have an information session, absolutely. Go to it if you can. If you can't, they record these things now because they're all done online. Download, look at the materials, and make sure that the notice of funding opportunity matches your needs, matches your plans. That you're not getting money that really doesn't really match what you want. You're going to develop a draft plan in your budget, and you have to ask yourself, what's the match on this particular grant? Do I need to take out a loan? Or do we need to finance to cover our cost? Are we going to get a loan through the project itself? And what is the timeline? What's a reasonable, realistic timeline? Now, in terms of especially federal dollars, and again, state dollars, especially when it's come to these state touring route stuff, you need to know your functional systems. So you can go through the New York State Functional Classification Viewer and figure out whether it's on a federal road. If it's an arterial, your available funds are different. There are funds available to you because you have arterials versus collectors or local roads, where there's going to be less money available that's direct. On the other hand, some of the FEMA money, when there's a natural disaster declared, there's different available funding. You may not actually be able to get reimbursed for some disaster problems if they're on the arterial system, something you might want to look into. Now, there are other road types for very low volume roads, and the reason I bring this up is people are going, boy, if I'm on a low volume road, how do I stay competitive? Well, you stay competitive by thinking about ways to deal with the reality of things. So how can you be more competitive? How could you in a small municipality be more competitive against a big municipality? Give me one word. Focus on safety. Yeah, that's a good one. Focus on safety. We're going to put a little wordle here real quick. Okay? Everybody's saying focus on safety. Make sure you have good plans. If you have ready, shovel-ready plans, as they're sometimes called, or local road safety plans in the safety arena, those will help you. In fact, some of the safety funds, if you don't have a local road safety plan, you're not even going to be able to get money for some of the implementation projects. So have a good plan. Have good things ready to go. And by the way, you can use the funds to develop the plans. Okay? You want to think about having a match. You want to make sure everything is ready. You're set to go. So let me give you some of the highlights of things I would put in my bailiwick to make sure I'm ready to be more competitive. Make sure you know the plans. Make sure you understand what they're good for, and make sure you've bundled everything you can bundle. In other words, if you've got a safety plan for one curve, why not do 3 or 4 curves at the same time? Why not bring 3 or 4 other municipalities in? That actually makes you more competitive because you're getting more bang for the buck. But make sure you have a really well-written, properly thought-out process, nice and clear and simple. Because, for instance, if you tell somebody you've got an emergency exit that goes on the stairs through the basement through the 3rd floor and it says you're on the 4th floor, people, as soon as they see that, that plan gets put aside. So make sure you have a well-written plan. Bridges and safety are always going to be eligible, so keep that in mind as well. Okay? Bridges and safety, if you're not sure, start there. That's a good place to start, and make yourself more competitive by bundling projects together and having well-written, comprehensive plans. So what am I going to do next when you leave this webinar? Well, ask yourself some questions. Is the grant process worth the revenue? I will tell you right now, there's more things you have to do with federal aid. There's even more things you have to do with state aid. Is the grant process worth the revenue? If you're going to spend a whole bunch of money for a $10,000 project, is it really worth it from a time standpoint? When you're done, can you maintain it? I've seen this happen, and this is crazy, but people will build something great, and then they shortchange themselves, and they can't maintain it, and now they have to maintain it with local dollars. Oh, that's tough. Don't do that, please. Okay? Now, where can you go to get help? We're going to ask you, and then we'll talk about where you can go to get help in just a minute, but think about where you're going to go to get help. And then, how long is it going to take to get a project done? How long does it take you to take a project from inception to construction? Can you get it done in less than a year? Or are you going to have to take several years? Yeah, it may take several years. If you're thinking 1, 2, 3, 4 years out, you're not looking at 2025. You're not looking at 2026. You may be looking at 4, 5, 6 years down the road. So think about that. And remember, with a grant, the timeline is probably going to be a little bit longer. Especially federal grants, you got to get it on the tip. You may have to add a year or 2 or even more to the project. So if you don't have an asset management plan, you may want to think about developing one. And actually, by the way, it will help you be more competitive. So I'm going to give you some ideas, and then we'll let you go on your way. Make sure you have a plan, okay, an overall plan and a project-specific plan, okay? And make sure you understand how that plan works, okay? Unlike our little stop sign here that's not working during the day at all. Go get some help. There's tons of places to go get some help. The state can help you. If you're in an MPO or Regional Planning and Development Board area, go talk to them. The federal government can actually help. If you're not sure who to contact, let us know. We can help you out. And then, of course, ask yourself, do you have the finances to cover the cost? Because you're going to have to cover the cost for a while. Do you have the staff to be able to manage and oversee the project? And at the end of the day, can you maintain it? If you can't maintain it, don't go build it. Okay? You may have to think about things slightly differently versus, oh, hey, it's free money. I've actually seen people say that with a project. It's a federal grant. It's not like it's our money. No. Federal grants, state grants, it's all your funds. It's just a different source to spread the cost out. Everybody's paying for it. Okay? With that, just as a quick reminder, we have one more webinar coming up before the end of the year next week on pavement management. And again, if you don't have a management plan, a great thing to come hear about and get started. And you can learn about pavement management, and then we'll be starting up after the holidays with departmental duties. Or you can go ahead and sign up for our spring workshops, and we'd love to see you there. If you have any questions about what we talked about today or any of our stuff or activities, send me an email, send an email to our general email address, or go online to nysltap.org, and you can get all the information here and a recording of this particular webinar. And with that, let me see. I'll give folks a chance to put in one question before Amanda says goodbye. We have some people thanking us for the webinar. Any questions? Give you about 10 seconds. With that, I'm not doing next week's webinar, so I'll be on at the beginning of it, but if I don't talk to somebody before, have yourself a great holiday. Maybe we'll see some of you around, and hopefully we'll definitely see a lot of you around in the spring. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.